The story of a teenager who grew up in a room where everything mattered. In a small American town, among the hills and green forests, lived James and Emily, brother and sister, separated by a few years of age. James was the older one and always had his own space, his own world, which was kept in his room. This room was not just a place to sleep or store things, it was his place of solitude, where he could be himself, where everything had its own meaning. On the walls hung posters of his favorite bands, on the shelves stood old books collected over the years, and in the corner stood an old model rocket that he assembled with his friends. This room contained his secrets, little things that others could not see, his personal moments that remained hidden from prying eyes. James's family lived in a fairly comfortable house. His parents worked, trying to provide everyone with everything they needed. His mother, Claire, was a very caring woman, but sometimes she lacked understanding of why certain things were so important to her children. She often helped organize family events, kept order, but she didn't always understand why some issues were so important to her children. When James graduated from school, it was time for him to go to another city to study. It was a big step in his life. His mother was happy that he would finally go to a new place, get an education, but at the same time she missed her eldest son. After leaving home, James did not return as often as his mother would have liked. He left with a lot of hopes for his future, and only occasionally visited home during the holidays. Emily was James's younger sister. She had always admired his things, his room, his world. She often went there to admire the way he organized his space. When James left home, Claire decided that her daughter no longer needed a small room for herself. So she made a decision: James's room would now belong to Emily. The mother hoped that this would help her daughter feel more grown up, because now she had her own space, which had previously been blocked off to her. Emily was delighted with the new room. She decided to change everything to her own way. She began to rearrange the interior, moving furniture, replacing James's old posters with her own favorite ones. She was very happy that now she could feel more grown up, more independent. But still, she could not help but feel that there was something uncomfortable in the fact that this room had once been a sacred place for her older brother. And then one day, when James returned home after a long period of study, he found that his room was no longer his. He immediately understood that it now belonged to Emily. This was an unpleasant shock for him. James was angry. He felt that his personal space had been violated. The room wasn't just a part of the house, it was part of his childhood, his personal world, his secrets. Claire tried to explain to James that now that he was no longer living at home, the room should be useful to someone else. She thought it was natural to change the use of the space, since it was no longer needed by James. She couldn't understand why her son was so emotional about it. She saw it as just a change, a new stage in his life. James couldn't understand how he could so easily get rid of something that had such great value to him. It wasn't just a room, it was his space, where he kept all his memories and thoughts. That place held parts of his childhood, parts of his thoughts, his experiences. He couldn't let other people touch these things. The story of a teenager who grew up in a room where everything mattered. Soon James began to look for a compromise. He tried to talk to Emily, to ask her not to change so much, not to go through his things. He even asked his mother to understand the importance of this room to him. But his mother could not imagine why it was so important to him. She thought that it was all just emotional experiences, that he would soon get used to it. Time passed, and James began to realize that he might not be able to turn everything back. He could not change what had already happened, and it was difficult to accept it. However, he understood that this moment of change was part of growing up, not only for him, but also for his family. It was a new stage, a new understanding of how relationships in a family change as children grow up, and parents must learn to let go. A few months later, when James returned home again, he no longer reacted so sharply to the change of room. He even began to see this as an opportunity for a new relationship with Emily. They began to discuss their shared memories, find new ways to spend time together. James also realized that many things in life change, and he could not hold on to the old things. The mother, after seeing how her children were able to find mutual understanding, began to realize more the importance of space for each of them. She learned to appreciate that her children were growing up and that change was a natural part of life, although not easy for parents. From that time on, James and Emily began to look at their relationship in a new way, and the room became just a symbol of how times change, how people themselves change. From the moment James and Emily found a common language and understood each other, their relationship really changed. At first, they just started to communicate more, because James, who had remained in the big city all this time, often forgot how important these simple moments from childhood were. He began to pay more attention to his sister, discovering for himself how much she had changed during the time he had been away. This was a new stage in their relationship that they could not help but notice. Emily, in turn, also began to appreciate the time she spent with her brother more. She was happy to take his advice and share her experiences, instead of just going through his things in his room, as she had before. She began to take a greater interest in his life in the city, asking about his studies, friends, and new interests. They even began to spend time together, helping each other with little things that had previously seemed unimportant. Claire, the mother, watched this change from the sidelines and felt a certain relief. She realized that letting go of her children did not mean losing them. On the contrary, it allowed them to find new ways to understand and support each other. At first, it was difficult for her to see her children grow up, how their relationships changed. She was attached to the time when everyone sat at the table together, when there were fewer disagreements and more carefree. But over time, Claire began to understand that change is an integral part of life, and that her children now have their own paths that do not have to depend entirely on her impressions or desires. She was able to accept that their needs and interests were changing, and that her role as a mother was now to support, not restrict. The story of a teenager who grew up in a room where everything mattered. The changes in James's room were a catalyst for each family member to re-evaluate their relationships. The mother no longer tried to keep her children within her boundaries, and the children began to understand that their individuality and personal boundaries were also important. A few months later, James returned home for the holidays and decided to spend more time with his family. He began to talk more about his life in the city, and his sister, instead of just listening, began to share her own thoughts about what was going on in her life. They began to understand each other more, and this connection between them grew. However, there was one thing that remained important to James: the old memories he kept in his room. They were related to his childhood and some events that he preferred not to forget. He decided that even though the room was no longer his, he could keep those memories in his heart and not let them fade away, even if the physical space changed. His mother understood this, and now, knowing that this process was helping James grow, was ready to support his decision. Claire, James and Emily then understood that the family should not hold on to the past, but should find ways to move forward together, respecting each other's personal boundaries. James's room became a symbol not only of change, but also of the importance of adapting to new circumstances and accepting each other as they are. Life went on, and although change was inevitable, each member of the family now knew that there was a place for everyone, both physically and emotionally. The family became more united, and although over time each of them went their own way, they still remained a support for each other. Time passed, and life in the family of James, Emily, and Claire gained new momentum. James had finished his studies and started working in another city, and Emily was finishing school and preparing to enter university. Claire, with all her experience of motherhood, had become increasingly aware of the importance of maintaining contact with her children without trying to interfere too actively in their lives. She understood that her role as a mother had now changed. Her children were growing up and acquiring their own beliefs, and she, in turn, had learned to give them space to do so. With each passing year, James and Emily became less dependent on each other, but at the same time their bond grew stronger. They valued the time they could spend together more. These were no longer the carefree days of childhood when they would simply play together or sit at the dinner table. Now they were quiet moments of reflection on a life that was becoming increasingly complex, with personal experiences, hopes, and fears. They began to be more attentive to each other, share their experiences, and support each other in times of difficult decisions. Claire watched her children change, realizing the importance of not holding on to the past, but giving them space to grow. She began to understand more that her children already had their own paths, and her role was not to control them but to be supportive when needed. Over time, James's room became a symbol of the changes that were taking place in the family. It was no longer just his space for personal moments and secrets, but a kind of shared territory for the family. James accepted that his childhood memories now belonged not only to him but also to his sister, and that time could not be turned back. The room. The story of a teenager who grew up in a room where everything mattered, although it looked completely different, was still not just a physical space. It was still a place where memories had once been formed, and although new stages of life had different rhythms, it was still a place to remind them that change is part of the natural process. Meanwhile, Claire realized that despite all the changes, love and support remained the same. She learned not to interfere in her children's lives, but to always be there when they needed her support. This became an important lesson for her, not to stop them on their path to adulthood, but to help them make their decisions. And so life went on. James, although he was rarely at home, felt that he had a place where he was always expected. Emily, who was also going through stages of change in her life, no longer felt lonely because she knew that there was someone who understood her. And Claire, although she missed the childhood years when her children were small, still felt that this was a normal process when children grow up and gain their own life experiences. The family became more united, and although each of its members went their own way, they knew that they could always count on each other's support. They understood that not only times change, but also people, and that this is not always a bad thing. This process helped them become closer and stronger, and eventually each of them found their place in a new reality that, although different, was still their own. As time went on, and although each member of the family continued to move forward, the changes that were taking place in their lives no longer seemed so scary or hostile. They learned to accept new stages without denying them, but on the contrary, understanding that they were part of the natural process. During such changes, the family, even at a distance, continued to be a single unit where everyone could find support when they needed it. Claire no longer felt the need to keep her children close to her. She no longer tried to control their choices, but instead learned to give them freedom and support when they turned to her. She realized that her role in her children's lives had changed. She was now more of an observer who supported them in time than one who gave constant instructions. Emily, who was increasingly immersed in her adult life, was grateful for the support of her mother and brother. She was no longer a little girl, but she knew that she could always rely on them when she needed it. Gradually, she found her way, determining what was important to her and what could be left behind. But even when she went through difficult moments, she always kept in mind that family was her foundation. James, although he lived far away, continued to maintain contact with his family. His understanding of family relationships also changed. He no longer perceived them as a constant presence in his life, but as something deep and stable, always remaining, even if not always visible or audible. Visits to home became even more meaningful to him. He began to realize that they were not just trips home, but an opportunity to return to a place that remained important to him, even if it was no longer his childhood room. The changes no longer had a negative connotation. Instead of experiencing them as losses, the family began to see them as opportunities for growth and new stages that each of them had to go through. They learned to find harmony between their individuality and what it means to be part of this family. The story of a teenager who grew up in a room where everything mattered. And while life can't always avoid difficult moments, the family realized that it's not just how their external world changes that matters, but also how they relate to each other. This became the foundation of their life together, which, while becoming new and different, always remained a place where they could be themselves and support each other in any circumstances. Over time, the family learned that true strength lies not in avoiding change, but in adapting to it and remaining united despite the new circumstances. All the changes that occurred did not destroy their bond, but only strengthened it. Each member of the family found his own path. But this path was not isolated from the others. They continued to support each other, even if their lives went in different directions. Claire realized that her children no longer needed constant control. She felt that their connection to her did not depend on where they lived or how much time they spent together. Her role as a mother changed. Now she was more of a support than a guide. She learned to listen rather than talk, and to understand that true support lies in being there when needed, and allowing her children to make their own choices. James, who increasingly realized the value of time spent with his family, came home often. These trips became more meaningful to him than just visits to his parents. He saw that his mother and sister had changed, and at the same time he noticed how they remained unwaveringly important to him. They were not part of his daily life, but their support and love became what helped him find his way in difficult moments. Emily, already growing up, began to make important decisions on her own. She was grateful that her parents never pressured her, but always gave her the opportunity to decide for herself how to build her future. Over time, she began to appreciate more those moments when she could simply be with them, not out of obligation, but out of desire. The changes, although inevitable, became proof for this family that it is not how often they see each other that is important, but that there will always be a connection between them. That does not depend on time or space. Each of them found their place in the new reality. And each understood that support, love and understanding have no time or space boundaries. James's room, which became Emily's place, was no longer just a part of his home, but a symbol of the importance of valuing not only physical space, but also the emotional support. That is the foundation of any relationship. It remained a place for memories, but also became a place for new stories to be born in their relationship. Eventually, the family realized that while time cannot be stopped, and people change, true relationships are based on the ability to support each other through all stages of life. And this ability to stay together, no matter what the circumstances, became the foundation that kept them together. They realized that every change is not an end, but a new beginning, and together they are ready to face whatever changes the future brings. Over time, the changes in the lives of James, Emily, and Claire became more and more noticeable. They increasingly found themselves in new roles, but without feeling like they were losing touch with their family. For Claire, the hardest part was that her children know the story of a teenager who grew up in a room where everything mattered longer needed the same attention as they had before. They were becoming more independent, but she understood that this was part of their growth and development. She was no longer the one who constantly pointed the way for them. But instead of feeling the pain of losing control, Claire began to rejoice in this, realizing that her children had become independent and able to make their own decisions. James, working in another city, thought more and more about his family. His life was filled with work and new responsibilities, but he lacked the warmth and support that he received at home. He began to come home more often for weekends or holidays. And even these short moments together became very important to him. He began to appreciate every moment spent with his family more and realized that although he longed for independence, his family was the foundation on which he could always lean. Emily, meanwhile, was going through a difficult stage in her life. She was gradually becoming an adult, and she had many important decisions to make. She could no longer remain a child who simply followed her parents' instructions. She was learning to determine her own path and become responsible for her own life. Her relationship with her mother had become more mature. Claire no longer gave her advice as often as she had before. Instead, they began to discuss situations more, and even if they did not always agree on everything, Emily increasingly valued her wisdom. James's room, although it had become part of Emily's new reality, still retained its importance as a symbol of change. This room was no longer just his personal space, but also a place where the relationships in the family were being re-evaluated. For James, it was a signal that the past changes, but does not disappear. Instead of keeping it as a symbol of his own space, he began to understand that what was more important was how these changes opened up new possibilities for the development of the family. Gradually, all family members began to realize the importance of change, although each of them experienced it in their own way. James, although he was physically far from home, felt that his place in the family remained unchanged. This became an important support for him in difficult moments. Claire, although she had come to terms with the fact that her children had grown up and become independent, found her joy and satisfaction in this. She no longer worried that her children no longer needed her constant attention, but on the contrary, she was grateful that they were able to grow into successful and independent people. The changes in Emily's life became noticeable not only for her, but also for her family. She increasingly began to feel the importance of her own decisions, but also realized that her family remained her foundation, even as she was finding her own path. She no longer depended on constant support, but she knew that when she needed it, her family would always be there, ready to help. The family gradually began to feel that although change was inevitable, it was not a reason to be sad. Instead, they began to see these changes as opportunities for growth and new possibilities. Each of them understood the importance of remaining open to new things, even if it meant letting go of old habits or worrying about the uncertainty of the future. Over time, as all three family members became more aware of the importance of personal boundaries in space, they began to find ways to support each other without imposing their views or beliefs. They learned to look at life with respect for others, allowing each to find the story of a teenager who grew up in a room where everything mattered, their own path, while still remaining supportive of each other. As a result, their relationship became no less warm, but much more mature and aware. The changes continued, but the family no longer perceived them as something negative. Everyone understood that this was just part of the process of growing up and developing. They began to appreciate what they had in each other more and to realize that even if their paths led them in different directions, the bond that united them would not disappear. The changes continued, and each member of the family began to understand more and more that even in the moments when they were apart from each other, their closeness did not diminish. James felt this every time he returned home, even if he did not come as often. After a few days at home, he realized that although this house was no longer the same for him as before, his emotional attachment to it had not disappeared. Sometimes he would stand in the hallway, listening to the sounds coming from other rooms, and he felt peace, knowing that his place was here, next to his family, even if this place was no longer the same as it had been in childhood. Emily, realizing the importance of independence, began to feel new challenges in life. She gradually learned to balance following her own convictions with being able to turn to her mother or brother for advice. Her relationship with Claire became deeper, no longer one-sided. Emily began to share her experiences and doubts, seeking support from her mother not out of necessity, but out of a desire to share something important. She no longer felt that her mother had to be a source of constant advice, now it was their mutual support, based on equality, even if they did not always agree on issues. Claire, in turn, began to feel that her place in the family was no longer the same as before. She was no longer the one who directed and controlled, but that did not mean that her role became less important. She understood that her support now was not about giving answers, but about being a reliable support, where you could find understanding and peace when you needed it most. Claire began to appreciate the moments when her children took the time to come home, even if it was just a short visit. James's room, which had become part of the life changes, was no longer just his territory. It became a symbol of how everyone in the family was able to change but still find common ground with others. It was no longer a place to keep secrets, but a place for new memories and discussions. The room was now an element that contributed to the understanding that each family member had the right to their own space, and at the same time, to support from those who mattered. The changes that had seemed so difficult at first were now the norm. The different stages of life that James, Emily, and Claire experienced became more mature and conscious with each passing year. They no longer tried to hold on to old habits or compare their present with the past. Instead, they began to accept each new situation as part of a larger process of life, where each stage had its own meaning. And although each of them moved in their own direction, they all knew that between them there would never be an invisible bond that kept them together, even if they were sometimes far apart. James, despite living far away, increasingly began to understand the importance of family ties. He saw his family changing, and how his mother and sister were becoming more mature, but this maturity did not mean distance. On the contrary, it allowed them to the story of a teenager who grew up in a room where everything mattered, understand each other better, to give freedom without distancing themselves from what united them. Emily also realized that now that she was starting to find her place in life, it was important to have support behind her, even if she no longer needed constant supervision or advice. Her family became a source of strength for her, to which she could return at any moment when the need arose. In fact, they all understood that change is not the end of something, but only a new beginning. They learned to live with these changes, to make them part of their lives, not being afraid to let go of the old and accept the new. And each of them, being in a different place or at a different stage of life, knew that there was always a place for family, where they could find support, love, and togetherness. The process of growing up was not always easy, but with each step James, Emily, and Claire became more open to change and more aware of the importance of not stopping where they had achieved, but moving forward, supporting each other in every stage of their lives. Over time, as change became part of their lives, the family realized one important thing: the true essence of their relationship was not to remain the same, but to be able to adapt and accept each other as they were, at each new stage of life. Everyone understood that this was not only a mother-child relationship, but also a growing up of each other in the context of love, support, and mutual respect. But still, despite all the changes in growing up, one day the unexpected happened. James After several years of reflection and visits home, made the decision to return to live with his parents. His life in another city became so complicated and stressful that, in the end, he realized that he felt the need to be there, to help and support his family. He did not return to restore what was once, but to begin a new stage, this time not out of obligation to others, but out of a choice to be there for those closest to him. Emily, who had already started living on her own, at first didn't understand why her brother wanted to come home again. She thought it was a sign that he hadn't found his place in the world. But later she realized that for James, it wasn't a defeat, but a choice. The choice wasn't simply to go back to what was, but to do something new, to be there, even if it meant giving up on his independence. Claire, who had long accepted the idea that children grow and go their own way, was surprised, but at the same time felt an incredible peace and joy. She realized that even in change, there was nothing permanent, that the connection between them was not physical proximity, but emotional support that would never disappear, no matter where they were. And so, when James returned, the room that had once been just his space became a place where he and Emily began to seek new moments together, not for the sake of recreating the past, but for the sake of creating something new. At that moment, they all understood. Together, change is not the end of something, but the beginning of a new understanding of what family is. And even if life does not always go according to plan, the most important thing is the ability to love and support, no matter how often you meet or what phase of life you are in. The story of a teenager who grew up in a room where everything mattered. And, although each of them continued to follow their own path, they were no longer afraid of change. They understood that the main thing is the ability to accept each new stage as an opportunity to grow and to strengthen their bond that will never fade. And so, one evening, when the whole family sat together, looking at old photos, they realized that a real home is not just walls, rooms, or things. It is a space where they can be themselves, where there is a place for everyone, and where all changes, even the most unexpected, only bring them closer to each other. And, although they were no longer the same people they were before, their love and support remained the same.